94 years takes a long time to pack into 26 cardboard boxes. When the county sheriff stepped onto Edith Lawson's porch on a damp Tuesday morning, he didn't bring a moving truck. He brought a clipboard, a heavy-duty padlock, and a notice of default that had officially expired at midnight. By noon, her mattress sat on the curb. By 2 o'clock, the neighborhood was dead silent. Then came the rumble. Not thunder. 250 heavyweight V-twin engines, turning the suburban asphalt into a vibrating drum. The hardest part of getting thrown out of your house isn't the muscle, it's the geometry. When you have lived in 900 square feet since the Truman administration, the house stops being a structure and becomes a prosthetic. Edith Lawson knew that from the edge of the kitchen sink to the left burner of the stove was exactly 3.5 shuffling paces. She knew that the third floorboard down the hallway groaned a B-flat when the humidity dropped below 50%. She knew the exact angle to strike the side of the 1984 General Electric toaster to keep the spring from catching. When Deputy Frank Novak knocked on the screen door at 8:15 a.m., he disrupted the geometry. Novak didn't want to be there. You could tell by the way he kept his thumbs hooked into his utility belt, pulling his trousers up every 40 seconds as if trying to physically lift himself out of the zip code. He was 42, possessed a mild case of acid reflux, and had a 17-year-old daughter who needed braces. He was a practitioner of the law, which is to say, he was a man who delivered bad news printed on 20-pound bond paper. "Mrs. Lawson," Novak said through the mesh. He didn't use his command voice. He used the voice people use in the waiting rooms of veterinary clinics. "It's Tuesday, ma'am." Edith was sitting at the small Formica table with a cup of Folgers. Her hands rested on the tabletop, skin the color of skim milk stretched over blue cordage. "I know the days of the week, Frank. My television gets the morning news just fine." "The grace period ran out yesterday at 5, he said. He looked over his shoulder at the street. Behind his cruiser sat a white Ford Transit van. 3 young men in matching gray T-shirts were leaning against the bumper, smoking disposable vapes and looking strictly at the pavement. They were paid $18 an hour by a regional logistics firm contracted by Pembroke Asset Management, LLC. Their job was to take 94 years of human existence and turn it into a curbside installation. "I have the tea kettle on," Edith said, her voice dry like 2 dry leaves rubbing together in a pocket. "You want a cup?" "I can't, ma'am. I have to ask you to step outside." There is a grand sweeping lie sold to the public that predatory evictions involve men in Italian suits rubbing their palms together in high-rise boardrooms. Reality is far more boring, which makes it far more lethal. It happens via an automated trigger in a software system hosted on a server in Delaware. Howard Lawson had passed away 21 years ago, leaving behind a clear title to the bungalow and a small, stubborn pension. But 12 years ago, a bad fall had required a hip replacement, which required a rehabilitation stay, which required a signature on a document presented by a very polite young man with a company lanyard. It was a reverse mortgage framed as a senior equity release program. When the property taxes spiked in 2024 due to a municipal rezoning initiative, the escrow fell short by $4,200. The algorithm flagged the account. 6 auto-generated letters were mailed. Because Edith's cataracts turned 8-point Helvetica into a gray smudge of crushed ants, the letters went into a wicker basket next to the telephone. The machine did not care about the cataracts. The machine only knew that line 14B was out of balance. By 10 a.m., the front yard looked like a yard sale held after a tornado. The 3 boys worked with a brutal, indifferent speed. They didn't break anything intentionally. They just lacked the reverence required to handle objects that had survived the Cold War. Out came the floral wingback chair, its upholstery faded by 40 summers of afternoon light hitting the south window. Out came the cedar chest containing Howard's honorable discharge papers from the Seabees. Out came 3 boxes of mason jars, a Hoover vacuum cleaner with a cracked red hood, and a framed print of the Sierra Nevadas with a chipped corner. The neighbors did what suburban neighbors do in the 21st century. They practiced the art of the tactical peek. Across the street, John pulled her horizontal blinds down just enough to create a 2-inch viewing aperture. Next door, a software engineer named Greg, who had bought his flipped house 6 months prior and had never once spoken to Edith, suddenly found a great deal of urgency in weeding his dandelions. Nobody came out. To step onto the sidewalk while an old woman's underwear drawer was being set near a storm drain felt like acknowledging a contagion. Poverty and displacement in America are treated like an airborne virus. People keep their distance lest the luck rub off on them. At 11:30 a.m., Deputy Novak presented Edith with a yellow carbon copy. "The county has an arrangement with the Red Roof Inn down on Route 9, Novak said, holding out a cheap plastic pen. "They have a voucher good for 6 nights. Social Services will assign a caseworker by Friday. I can give you a lift over there right now, Mrs. Lawson, get you out of the sun." Edith looked at the pen. Then she looked at her wingback chair sitting on the patch of dead crabgrass near the curb. "My husband planted that dogwood," she said, pointing a trembling crooked finger toward the small tree near the driveway. "He dug the hole with a spade he borrowed from a man named Moretti, who used to live where the blue house is now. He got a blister on his left palm the size of a 50-cent piece." "Yes, ma'am," Novak said, sweating through his uniform shirt. "It's a nice tree. I am not going to a motel, Frank." She walked down the 3 wooden porch steps, 1, 2, 3, holding the handrail with both hands. She walked across the lawn, sat down in her wingback chair right there on the grass, folded her hands in her lap, and looked straight ahead at the asphalt. Novak stood on the porch for a long time. He checked his watch. His shift ended at 3. He sighed, pulled the heavy brass master lock out of his pocket, looped it through the steel hasp of the front door, and pressed it shut. Click. The sound was small, but it carried across the dead silent street like a gunshot. People who haven't reached 80 believe that the very old spend their twilight hours contemplating the grand, majestic arc of their lives. They assume the mind drifts through monumental milestones, weddings, the births of children, the great wars, the turn of centuries. They don't. The very old think about the small, irritating mechanics of the immediate present. Sitting in the midday heat, Edith wasn't thinking about the Great Depression. She was thinking about the half-empty jar of Smucker's strawberry preserves sitting on the middle shelf of the refrigerator. She had opened it on Sunday. By tomorrow afternoon, with the power cut off by the asset management firm, the heat inside that kitchen would reach 90 degrees. The pectin would break down. A thin, gray layer of mold would form over the red fruit. It felt like a profound, unforgivable waste of $3.40. She closed her eyes against the glare off the hood of Novak's departing cruiser. Behind her eyelids, the house wasn't empty. It was 1974. The smell wasn't ozone and cut grass. It was Gojo hand cleaner, burnt solder, and Chesterfield Kings. Howard had operated a small 2-bay independent repair shop on 4th Street down by the freight yards. He wasn't a master businessman. He was an intuitive savant with internal combustion. While the major dealerships were charging $80 an hour to look at a transmission, Howard would sit on a milk crate with a stethoscope pressed against an engine block, listening to the valves like a doctor listening to a murmur. Because of where the shop was located, the clientele was mixed. There were the local delivery drivers, the desperate single mothers with dying station wagons, and then there were the guys with the winged death heads on their backs. The local charter of the Hells Angels had established a clubhouse 3 blocks from Howard's Bays in the late 60s. Most of the town treated them like an invading army of barbarians, locking their doors, pulling their children inside when the choppers sputtered past. Howard treated them like men who owned machines that required precise valve clearances. Edith remembered a Tuesday in August of 1981. She had brought Howard his lunch in a brown paper sack. Sitting on an overturned bucket in the shade of the garage was a 20-year-old kid with a fresh patch on his vest, a broken nose that hadn't been set right, and a left arm wrapped in a blood-spotted grease rag. His bike, a rigid frame shovel head, was strapped to Howard's lift. "You're stripping the thread on that primary cover, son," Howard had said, not looking up from his workbench. "You put that much torque on aluminum. You're going to be walking home to the clubhouse with your oil in your boots." The kid had scowled, trying to look like a hardened outlaw, but his eyes were bright red from road wind and exhaustion. "Just get it running, man. I got to be in San Bernardino by midnight." Edith hadn't asked permission. She had walked over to the shop refrigerator, pulled out a pitcher of cold Lipton tea, poured it into a clean glass, and handed it to the boy along with half of Howard's ham sandwich. "Eat," she had said. The kid looked at the sandwich like it was a live hand grenade. "I ain't got the cash for food, lady." "Did I ask you for $1? Edith had snapped, her voice possessing the terrifying absolute authority of a woman who had raised 3 brothers through the Dust Bowl. "Put it in your mouth and chew. You look like a wet scarecrow." That kid's name was Deacon Ross. There had been no grand pact signed in blood. There were no movie scene speeches about brotherhood. It was just a transaction of basic dignity rendered in a decade when the rest of the city looked at the men in the leather vests as human refuse. Howard fixed their bikes fairly. Edith gave them ice water and told them to wash the grease off their knuckles before touching her porch railing when they came to pick up their keys. When Howard died in 2005, 46 motorcycles had escorted the hearse to the county cemetery. They hadn't revved their engines. They had idled at the back of the procession, silent as iron statues, before turning around and riding back to the low-income flats. 20 years is a long time. People disperse, neighborhoods gentrify. The shop on 4th Street had been bulldozed in 2014 to make way for a boutique dog bakery. Edith opened her eyes. A teenager on a rusted mongoose bicycle was standing on the sidewalk 10 feet away, 1 foot resting on the pedal. It was Leo, the 16-year-old from 2 blocks over who mowed her grass for $20 whenever his father's lawnmower had gas. He looked at the furniture. He looked at the padlock on the door. He looked at Edith sitting in the armchair. "Mrs. Lawson?" Leo asked, his voice cracking on the second syllable. "What are they doing with your stuff?" "The bank owns the wood now, Leo," she said quietly. "They want the room inside." Leo didn't know what a writ of possession was. He didn't understand the secondary mortgage market or the legal definitions of an unsecured creditor. What he understood was that the old lady who always gave him a cold Canfield's ginger ale and let him keep the change from a 20 was sitting in the dirt next to a bag of cat litter. He reached into the pocket of his basketball shorts and pulled out a phone with a spiderweb cracked screen. He didn't ask her. He just stepped back, framed the shot. The small, frail woman sitting in the faded armchair, the pile of cardboard boxes, the official orange notice slapped to the front window, and pressed the button. He opened a hyper-local Facebook group called East Side Neighborhood Watch and Sound Board, a digital clearinghouse usually reserved for complaints about off-leash pit bulls and stolen catalytic converters. He typed with both thumbs. "They literally threw 94-year-old Mrs. Lawson out on the street today over some bank BS. She's just sitting there. This city is trash." He hit post. Then he kicked his pedal and rode away, because he was 16 and didn't know what else a person was supposed to do when the world broke in front of them. 4 miles away, behind an industrial park that housed a commercial laundry facility and a scrap metal distributor, sat a windowless cinder-block building painted the color of wet slate. Heavy steel reinforced the door frames. 8 security cameras sat inside protective iron cages under the eaves. Inside, the air smelled of stale Folgers, damp wool, and the sharp chemical tang of brake cleaner. Deacon Ross sat at the head of a long oak table that had been salvaged from a defunct bowling alley in 1991. He was 62 years old now. The skinny kid with the busted nose had filled out into a man with a chest like a commercial freezer and a gray beard that reached the top button of his flannel shirt. His left knee had been replaced twice. His right ear rang with a permanent high-pitched hiss, the receipt for 40 years of riding straight pipe exhausts without earplugs. He was reading a printout of a lawyer's invoice regarding a zoning dispute for their annual charity toy run when a man named Kemp walked into the room. Kemp was 31, built like a collegiate wrestler, and spent 3 hours a day on his phone. He didn't speak the old biker slang. He spoke the language of screenshots and group chats. "Deke," Kemp said, sliding his phone across the scarred oak of the bowling alley lane. "Look at this." Deacon didn't pick up the phone. He reached into his vest pocket, pulled out a pair of $3 reading glasses from Walgreens, slid them onto his nose, and leaned over the screen. He saw the orange sticker first. Then he saw the white hair. Then his eyes drifted to the background, to the porch. Specifically, to the bottom wooden step, where the pine board had a distinct crescent-shaped gouge out of the left corner where Howard Lawson had dropped a 20-pound sledgehammer in the summer of 1988. Deacon stared at the screen for 12 seconds. He didn't blink. The room went dead quiet, save for the hum of the commercial beverage cooler in the corner. "Who posted this?" Deacon asked. His voice didn't rise. It dropped into the register where the chest cavity vibrates before the vocal cords do. "Some kid down on the avenues," Kemp said. "Happened about 2 hours ago. Property management company out of the city called Pembroke secured the order. Sheriff signed off this morning." In the movies, an outlaw motorcycle club operates like a chaotic mob of screaming wild men. In the cold, unfilmed reality of the modern era, a serious charter operates with the rigid, terrifying bureaucracy of a Prussian infantry regiment. There are bylaws, there are phone trees, there are jurisdictional boundaries that are observed with religious fanaticism. Deacon stood up. He took off the reading glasses and dropped them into his pocket. "Call the charter in the valley," Deacon said to Kemp. "Call the boys down in South City. Tell them we have a situation regarding Howard Lawson's widow." "How many guys you want me to ask for?" Deacon looked at the photograph again, at the small, blue-veined hands folded neatly over the faded floral fabric of the armchair. "Don't ask," Deacon said. "Tell them to put the steel on the ground, everyone who has a bike that turns over. We meet at the abandoned Safeway lot on 8th at 3:30. Nobody drinks. Nobody brings heat. You wear your full colors." By 3:45 p.m., the sky over the city had turned the color of a bruised plum, thick with the humid, heavy air that precedes a late summer thunderstorm. On Edith Street, a white Toyota Corolla pulled into the driveway of the Lawson bungalow. Out stepped Kevin. Kevin was 26, wore a moisture-wicking polo shirt with the Pembroke Asset Management logo embroidered on the left breast, and carried a cordless DeWalt drill. His job was the secondary phase of the asset recovery process, securing the perimeter against vagrancy. He had 3 sheets of pre-cut exterior plywood in his trunk. He walked past Edith without looking at her. It was a skill they taught in the onboarding seminars. Maintain professional detachment. Do not engage with former occupants to avoid de-escalation protocols. He set the first sheet of plywood against the front door frame. He pulled a 3-inch deck screw out of his canvas pouch, fitted it to the magnetic tip of his drill, and pressed it against the mahogany trim Howard Lawson had sanded by hand in 1961. Whirr, pft! The screw bit into the old wood. Edith flinched. It was the first time she had moved in 3 hours. That sound, the high-speed tear of modern steel tearing into 70-year-old grain, felt like someone driving a needle into the quick of her fingernail. Kevin reached for a second screw. He didn't get to place it. It started 3 blocks away, a low baritone vibration that didn't register in the ears first, but in the soles of the feet. Greg, the software engineer next door, stopped his lawnmower because he thought a low-flying military transport plane was experiencing engine failure. Down the street, a golden retriever inside the blue house began to bark frantically, scratching at the living room window. The sound grew. It wasn't the erratic, high-pitched whine of imported sport bikes. It was the synchronized, massive displacement of air caused by 250 large-bore American engines moving at 20 miles per hour in a staggered formation. They turned the corner onto the residential street. They took up both lanes. The lead row consisted of 5 riders, Deacon Ross in the center on a blacked-out touring frame, his face set like carved walnut beneath his matte gray helmet. Behind him stretched a sea of chrome, black leather, denim, and red and white patches that filled the entire visual horizon of the two-lane street. The vibration hit the front windows of the bungalows. The glass in Edith's living room bay window began to sing a tiny, sympathetic harmonic. Kevin stopped his drill. He turned around, the 3-inch screw still held between his thumb and forefinger. His jaw didn't drop. His entire facial structure seemed to go slack, the professional detachment evaporating into pure lizard brain primate terror. The column didn't roar past. Deacon raised his left fist into the air. 250 right hands squeezed 250 front brake levers. The entire mile-long steel dragon came to a halt right in front of the Lawson property. Then, 250 thumbs hit their kill switches in a cascading wave of mechanical clicks. The sudden silence that followed was heavier than the noise. 250 steel kickstands snapping down against asphalt sounds like the bolt-action mechanism of a giant unseen rifle. Clack, 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 clack. It rolled down the street in a jagged metallic wave. Kevin did not drop his DeWalt drill. His fingers had locked around the yellow plastic handle with the rigid, white-knuckled grip of a corpse. He stood on the bottom step of the Lawson bungalow, his polo shirt plastered to his collarbones by sudden sweat, watching 250 men swing their heavy boots over their saddles. They didn't rush him. That was the terrifying part. A mob runs, an organization walks. They moved onto the sidewalk with the slow, synchronized indifference of rising floodwater. There was no screaming. There were no theatrical threats. There was only the sound of heavy leather creaking, the jingle of brass wallet chains, and the dense collective exhale of men who had just spent 40 minutes riding through city traffic in 85-degree heat. Deacon Ross walked up the concrete walkway. He limped slightly, his left prosthetic knee clicking a faint mechanical cadence beneath his grease-stained denim. He stopped 5 feet from the bottom step. He didn't look at Kevin's face. He looked at the sheet of exterior plywood resting against the door frame, and then at the single 3-inch deck screw protruding half an inch from the old mahogany. "You're splitting the grain," Deacon said. Kevin's mouth opened. No sound came out. His vocal cords felt dry as sandpaper. I have a work order from the county." "You have a cordless drill," Deacon corrected softly. He reached into his vest, pulled out a red shop rag, and slowly wiped the highway soot from his forehead. "And you got about 3 seconds to put it in your trunk before my boys decide to see if it runs on AC or DC power. Walk away, son. Go get a iced coffee." Kevin looked past Deacon's shoulder. Behind the big man stood Kemp, his arms crossed over a chest that looked like a upholstered refrigerator, his knuckles tattooed with faded blue-black script. Behind Kemp stood 40 more men blocking the driveway. Behind them stood 200 more blocking the street. Kevin didn't pack up his spare plywood. He didn't ask for his screws back. He walked down the lawn, stepping carefully over a box of Edith's winter sweaters, got into his white Corolla, put it in reverse, and backed down the street at 30 miles an hour until he hit the intersection. Deacon watched the car disappear. Then he turned around. Edith Lawson was still sitting in her floral wingback chair on the dead crabgrass. She hadn't flinched when the bikes arrived. She sat with her spine straight, her hands folded in her lap, her pale blue eyes fixed on the man with the gray beard. Deacon took off his matte gray helmet, tucked it under his left arm, and walked over to the edge of the grass. He didn't loom over her. He dropped down onto his one good knee, his leather vest brushing the dirt, putting his eyes level with hers. "You tracking road oil onto my lawn, Deacon Ross," Edith said. Her voice was thin, but it didn't shake. Deacon's hard, weathered face broke into a smile that showed a chipped bottom tooth. "Grass is dead anyway, Mrs. Lawson. Howard would have tilled this up and planted tomatoes 3 months ago." "Howard had a spine," she said sharply. Then her eyes drifted to his gray beard, tracking the 40-year chasm between the skinny kid who ate her ham sandwich and the old man kneeling in the dirt. "You put on weight." "They put preservatives in the beer now," he said. He reached out, his massive calloused hand, scarred by sheet metal and road rash, and gently touched the back of her frail, translucent wrist. "We got your message." "I didn't send no message. Some boy took my picture like I was a prize pumpkin at the fair. Well, Deacon said, looking back at the 26 cardboard boxes stacked haphazardly near the curb. The pumpkin won first place. Kemp stepped forward, moving with surprising lightness for a man of his displacement. Yeah, boss. Get the prospects. We aren't breaking the county seal on that front door. I ain't giving the sheriff an excuse to put her in a holding cell for trespassing, but this furniture is sitting on a public easement. Deacon pointed a thick finger at the covered porch. Move everything under the overhang. Stack it neat. If I see a single scratch on that cedar chest, the man who did it is going to be buffing primary covers with a toothbrush until Christmas. What followed was the most surreal exercise in logistics the suburban street had ever witnessed. Across the road, Jean dropped her horizontal blinds entirely, pressing her forehead against the glass. Next door, Greg stood on his porch with his phone out, live streaming the event to a private Discord server of remote tech workers who couldn't comprehend the metric. 30 bikers, mostly young men in their 20s wearing the blank bottom rocker vests of prospects, formed a bucket brigade across the lawn. They moved with absolute, terrifying reverence. A 240-pound man with a spiderweb tattooed across his throat carried a box of delicate porcelain teacups as if he were transporting a donor heart. Two guys in steel-toed engineer boots carefully lifted the floral wingback chair, with Edith still sitting in it, and carried her like a Babylonian queen across the grass, up the 3 wooden steps, and set her down gently on the shaded porch. Left a little, Edith commanded, waving 2 fingers. The afternoon sun hits the left armrest if you leave it centered. It fades the roses. Yes, ma'am, the giant with the throat tattoo mumbled, carefully adjusting the chair 3 inches to the port side. By 4:30 p.m., the curb was empty. The boxes were stacked in rigid geometric columns against the siding of the house. The Hoover vacuum cleaner was tucked behind the porch swing. Deacon sat on the top step, his back against the rail where Howard used to flick his cigarette ashes. He pulled his phone out and dialed a number with a 312 area code. Jensen, a woman's voice answered on the second ring. Crisp, expensive. Rebecca, Deacon said, watching a dark, heavy thundercloud roll over the oak trees 2 blocks east. It's Ross. I need you to pull a property deed in Pembroke County, parcel number 442-A, belonging to Howard and Edith Lawson. Asset firm called Pembroke Management just executed a lockout. There was the sound of a keyboard clacking through the receiver. On what grounds? Reverse mortgage default. Taxes went up. Escrow dipped. Deke. If the sheriff executed the writ, the redemption period is closed. It's statutory post-foreclosure. I can't magically unsign a judge's order. I don't need you to unsign it today, Deacon said softly, his eyes scanning the street where 250 motorcycles were parked shoulder to shoulder, their chrome reflecting the purple pre-storm light. I just need you to find the clerical error. Because I got 250 guys sitting on the sidewalk, and the sky is about to open up, and none of us brought rain gear. The law is not a moral document. It is a geographic map of permissions. When Deputy Frank Novak returned to 4th Avenue at 5:15 p.m., he brought the map with him. He also brought 3 additional county cruisers, their red and blue LED light bars cutting through the premature twilight of the gathering storm. The dispatch call had been categorized as an unauthorized assembly/interference with municipal officers, a code that usually prompted officers to unholster their cans of oleoresin capsicum spray before putting their vehicles in park. Novak didn't unholster anything. He stepped out of his cruiser, felt the heavy wet air hit his face, and looked at the wall. The bikers hadn't blocked the driving lane. That would have been a violation of State Statute 316.2045, obstruction of a public roadway, which would have allowed the city to call in commercial flatbeds and start impounding $20,000 motorcycles. Instead, they had executed a masterpiece of municipal compliance. Every bike was parked legally within the 12-inch distance from the curb, mandated by city ordinance. The 250 riders were sitting on the concrete curb edge, standing on the public sidewalk, or sitting cross-legged on Edith Lawson's front lawn. Novak walked up to the property line. His right hand rested habitually on his belt. "Ross," he called out. Deacon stood up from the porch step and walked down the walkway. He didn't cross the property line onto the city sidewalk. He stopped exactly 2 inches inside the perimeter of Edith's crabgrass. "Frank," Deacon said. "You can't be here, Deacon. Pembroke owns the parcel as of 9 o'clock this morning. This is private property now. You're trespassing." "Am I?" Deacon asked. He pulled a folded piece of yellow loose-leaf paper from his back pocket and held it out. "Read the bottom." Novak took the paper. Written in shaky cursive script that looked like the cardiogram of a dying bird was a single sentence. "I, Edith Lawson, invite the bearer of this note and his associates to stand on my grass as my personal guests." It was signed at the bottom. "She doesn't own the grass anymore, Deke. The bank does." "The bank owns the title," Deacon corrected, his voice dropping into that quiet, terrifying baritone. "But her tenancy isn't legally concluded until her personal effects are removed from the premises by the county logistics contractor, which, as you can see, they ain't. Her chair's on the porch. Her clothes are in those boxes. Until the county takes possession of her chattels, she retains lawful occupancy of the curtilage. We're invited guests of the occupant, Frank. You want to arrest 250 taxpayers for standing on a lawn with permission?" Novak looked at the paper. Then he looked at the street. Behind Deacon, the prospects had begun distributing black plastic 33-gallon trash bags. They weren't using them for vandalism. They were punching head and arm holes in the bottoms, turning them into makeshift rain ponchos. A guy with a gray ponytail was methodically sweeping the gutter with a broom he had brought from his saddlebag, ensuring no gravel obstructed the storm drain. "They're going to call the state police, Deacon," Novak said quietly. He stepped closer, dropping his official voice. "Pembroke's regional director is already screaming at the captain on the phone. They're saying you're an organized criminal enterprise executing an illegal occupation." "Let 'em call," Deacon said. A single fat drop of rain hit the crown of his bald head. "State police get paid by the hour. My boys are on vacation." At 5:40 p.m., the bottom fell out of the sky. It wasn't a gentle agricultural rain. It was a Midwestern summer deluge, the kind that turns gutters into whitewater rivers and turns the air into a solid sheet of gray water. In the bungalows across the street, people pressed their faces against the glass to watch the barbarians scatter. They expected the bikers to run for the overhangs of the neighboring garages or to start their engines and flee for the interstate. Nobody moved. On the porch, Kemp and 3 prospects unrolled a massive 20 by 30-foot heavy-duty blue polyethylene tarp they had retrieved from a support truck. They didn't cover themselves. They hoisted the tarp over the porch rafters, securing the brass grommets to the wooden pillars with bungee cords, creating a secondary waterproof envelope around Edith Lawson and her 26 boxes. Out on the lawn, 180 men sat on the ground in their black plastic trash bags, their heads bowed against the torrential downpour. The rain hit their leather vests with a sound like frying bacon. Water ran down their gray beards, dripped off their noses, and pooled in the creases of their engineer boots. They didn't speak. They didn't complain. They sat in the mud like a terracotta army carved out of asphalt and beef jerky, holding the perimeter line against an enemy that existed entirely inside a fiber optic cable. Inside the blue envelope on the porch, Edith sat dry as a bone. She looked at the wall of broad, wet backs shielding her front yard. Then she looked at Kemp, who was standing near the screen door with water dripping from his earlobes onto his shoulders. "Young man," Edith said over the roar of the rain hitting the polyethylene. Kemp turned around, wiping water from his eyes. "Ma'am, open that cooler bag behind the swing, the blue one." Kemp walked over, unzipped the insulated bag, and looked inside. "There's 6 cans of Ensure, a half loaf of Wonder Bread, and a jar of strawberry jam." "Take the bread and the jam," she instructed, pointing a bony finger toward the kitchen window. "Reach through that broken pane where the boy took the screen out. My butter knife is sitting on the drying rack next to the sink. Spread the jam thick. Those boys out in the grass look like drowned rats, and I won't have people starving on my property while the county is trying to steal it." Bradley Foster did not understand the physical world. He understood spreadsheets, risk-adjusted capitalization rates, and the seamless, frictionless beauty of automated asset liquidation. He was 34 years old, wore a tailored charcoal suit that cost more than Howard Lawson's first tow truck, and drove a silver BMW i4 that hummed like a high-end refrigerator. At 8:30 the next morning, the sunlight cutting through the humid post-storm haze reflected blindingly off the hood of his sedan as he turned onto 4th Avenue. He had come to supervise the commercial eviction crew he had hired out of the city, 4 men with a 20-foot box truck charging $95 an hour. He stopped his car 90 feet from the Lawson house. The 20-foot box truck was already there. It was parked in the center of the road, its hazard lights blinking uselessly. Blocking its path were 42 motorcycles parked diagonally across the asphalt, their front wheels turned and locked. Sitting on the hood of the commercial moving truck was Deacon Ross, drinking a cup of black coffee from a styrofoam cup, his boots resting gently against the truck's chrome grille. Foster got out of his BMW. His shoes, bespoke Italian leather with 0 traction, slipped slightly on the damp street. "Officer!" Foster yelled, spotting Deputy Novak leaning against his patrol car near the corner. "Why aren't these vehicles being cleared? We have a valid writ of possession signed by Judge Moretti." Novak didn't push himself off his fender. He took a slow sip from his own thermal mug. "Street's a public right-of-way, Mr. Foster. They aren't violating noise ordinances, and they paid their registration tabs. I can't tow parked vehicles without a municipal parking infraction. They are obstructing a court-ordered asset recovery." Foster marched toward the driveway, his face flushing the color of a bruised peach. He pointed his finger at Deacon. "You are in violation of federal banking statutes regarding collateral interference. I have the county sheriff's department on speed dial." "Save your battery, Bradley," a voice said. A black Lincoln Navigator had pulled up behind Foster's BMW. The driver's door opened, and Rebecca Jensen stepped out. She wasn't wearing biker denim. She was wearing a navy blue Armani sheath dress and 3-inch heels that clicked against the pavement with the sharp, rhythmic authority of an executioner's axe. She carried a leather briefcase that looked like it contained the launch codes for a mid-sized nuclear power plant. Foster blinked. He recognized the register. "Who are you?" "Rebecca Jensen. Senior partner Jensen, Vance, and Abernathy. I represent the East Side Charter Corporation, as well as Mrs. Edith Lawson." "She doesn't have counsel. She's a defaulted debtor." "She has counsel as of 11 p.m. last night," Rebecca said, stopping 3 feet from Foster. She didn't offer her hand. She unzipped her briefcase, pulled out a stack of documents secured with a heavy binder clip, and tapped them against her forearm. "And you have a significant liability problem under the Truth in Lending Act, Section 129C. Foster scoffed, trying to regain his vertical height. "The reverse mortgage was executed in 2012. The statute of limitations for TILA claims is 3 years. For standard origination disclosures, yes." Rebecca smiled. It was not a warm expression. It was the smile of a surgeon mapping an incision. "However, under mandatory HUD guidelines revised in 2018 regarding HECM, home equity conversion mortgages, any recalculation of escrow deficiencies exceeding 20% of the baseline annual disbursement requires in-person service of a counseling notice to borrowers over the age of 80. Foster's jaw tightened. "We mailed 6 notices via certified post, which were returned unsigned," Rebecca said, flipping to page 4 of her bundle. "At which point, Section 4B mandates that your firm contract a licensed process server to physically deliver the document to the occupant. Instead, your automated compliance software dropped the flag into a secondary queue and initiated a bulk mail publication notice in the County Legal Gazette, a periodical with a circulation of 400 people, none of whom are 94 old widows with macular degeneration. The court validated the default," Foster insisted, but his voice had lost its metallic ring. It sounded thin, like cheap tinfoil tearing. The court validated a default based on an affidavit of proper service signed by your vice president of operations, Rebecca said softly. She stepped closer, her perfume, something sharp and citrusy, cutting through the smell of motorcycle exhaust. An affidavit that is legally defined as perjury if filed with reckless disregard for statutory HOD service protocols. I filed an emergency motion to vacate the writ at 8 a.m. with Judge Moretti's clerk. A hearing is set for Friday. That's 3 days, Foster said, looking past her toward the bungalow. On the porch, Edith Lawson was sitting in her wingback chair eating a piece of toast. Behind her stood Kemp and 3 giant men in leather vests, looking down at Foster with the calm, analytical curiosity of men watching a beetle crawl across a hot stove. Yes, Rebecca said. She looked at her Rolex. 3 days, during which time the property remains under contested judicial review, which means your logistics team cannot touch those boxes, and if your firm attempts to enforce a voided writ via private security. She gestured vaguely toward the street where 250 men were currently cleaning their sunglasses and adjusting their belt buckles. I believe my clients intend to exercise their right to peaceful citizens' observation. Foster looked at the paperwork. He looked at the moving truck he was paying $95 an hour to sit and park. Then he looked at Deacon Ross, who raised his styrofoam cup in a silent, mocking toast. Without a word, Foster turned around, walked back to his BMW, got inside, and slammed the door. The electric motor whirred, and the silver car reversed down the street, fleeing the physical world for the safety of the cloud. By noon, the sun had baked the suburban street back to its normal, suffocating humidity. The 250 motorcycles didn't leave all at once. They departed in staggered cohorts of 20, their engines firing up in sequential rumbles that shook the leaves off the dogwood tree. They had jobs, some of them. They had families. They had bail bonds to pay and transmissions to rebuild. By 2 p.m., only 12 bikes remained parked along the curb. Deacon sat at the Formica kitchen table inside the bungalow. The master lock was gone. Cut off the hasp by Kemp using a 24-inch bolt cutter, while Deputy Novak looked pointedly at a cloud formation to the west. The air inside the house was hot and smelled of old dust, but the refrigerator was humming again, powered by a heavy-duty yellow extension cord running out the kitchen window to a portable Honda generator Kemp had chained to the porch railing. Edith set a fresh cup of Folgers down in front of Deacon. Her hand trembled, spilling 3 drops of dark liquid onto the white tabletop. Deacon didn't wipe it up. He wrapped his thick, scarred fingers around the ceramic mug. Nita, that lawyer girl's going to cost a mint, Edith said, sitting down opposite him. I got $1,200 in the credit union, Deacon, and that's from my plot next to Howard. Rebecca works on retainer for the corporate entity, Deacon said, blowing gently on his coffee. Club pays her $20,000 a month to make sure the city doesn't zone out our clubhouse. She had 3 hours to kill this morning anyway. Don't lie to me, son. I changed your bandages when you took that pavement off Route 4. Deacon looked down into his black coffee. For a second, the 62-year-old warlord vanished, replaced entirely by the desperate kid who had walked into a greasy 2-bay garage with no money and a broken primary cover. Howard didn't charge me for the helicoil, Deacon said quietly. He spent 3 hours drilling out that aluminum block. I asked him why he didn't just tell me to junk the motor. You know what he said? Edith looked toward the window, toward the dogwood tree standing still in the summer heat. He said machines ain't disposable just because they get old. Yeah, Deacon said. He drank his coffee. He did. Outside, Kemp was sitting on the bottom porch step, using a pocket knife to scrape the dead wood out of the crescent-shaped gouge Howard's sledgehammer had left 38 years ago. He wasn't fixing it. He was just cleaning the dirt out of the scar, making sure the wood stayed clean before the next rain hit. There's a peculiar, sterile violence to municipal courtrooms. It is a deliberate stripping away of human context until nothing remains but docket numbers, filing stamps, and the exhausted sighs of overworked clerks who have watched 10,000 lives dissolved between morning coffee and the lunch recess. Courtroom 3B smelled of industrial floor wax, damp wool, and the faint minty residue of cheap disinfectant. Judge Walter Davis sat beneath the municipal seal, rubbing his temples with two liver-spotted fingers. He was 58 years old, possessed a bad lumbar disc from 30 years of sitting in leather chairs, and had 84 landlord-tenant disputes scheduled before 1 p.m. To Walter Davis, property law was a sewage treatment plant. His only job was to keep the pipes from backing up into the hallway. Item 14, the bailiff droned, not looking up from his clipboard. Pembroke Asset Management versus Lawson. Emergency motion to vacate writ of possession. Representing Pembroke was a 29-year-old associate named Spencer. Spencer wore a slim-cut navy suit, carried an iPad Pro with a magnetic stylus, and had the aggressive, caffeinated posture of a man who believed the law was a competitive video game. "Your Honor," Spencer said, stepping to the podium before the bailiff had even finished pronouncing the docket number. "This is a standard post-foreclosure holdover. The respondent defaulted on an escrow deficiency exceeding $4,000. Statutory notice was published. The writ was properly executed by the sheriff on Tuesday. The respondent's current occupation of the curtilage is supported solely by an unlawful coordinated act of physical intimidation by an outlaw motorcycle gang." In the third row of the gallery sat Deacon Ross and Kemp. They hadn't ridden their bikes to the courthouse. They had taken Kemp's rusted Ford Ranger. They weren't wearing their leather cuts or their bottom rockers. They wore faded, button-down Sears work shirts over their heavy ink, their stiff collars buttoned to the collarbone, holding their grease-stained ball caps in their laps like union boilermakers attending a foreman's funeral. Rebecca Jensen stood up from the petitioner's table. She didn't use a stylus. She set a single 3-ring binder on the oak podium. "Judge," Rebecca said, her voice dropping into the quiet, resonant frequency that forces a noisy room to lean forward. Pembroke management did not execute a standard foreclosure. They executed a procedural ambush on a 94-year-old legally blind widow. "Counsel," Judge Davis sighed, his pen hovering over his legal pad. "The mortgage contract allows for escrow recalculation. Did your client pay the $4,000? "My client was never properly served the demand, Your Honor. Under federal HECM servicing guidelines, any escrow adjustment exceeding 20% on a senior borrower requires verifiable certified personal delivery. Pembroke's automated system mailed 6 notices to an address with an incorrect zip code, a clerical error generated by their own intake software in 2021. When the Postal Service returned those envelopes marked undeliverable, Pembroke did not dispatch a human process server. They bypassed mandatory HUD secondary protocols and dropped a 3-line legal notice into a rural commercial gazette." Spencer tapped his iPad screen rapidly. "The statute does not require us to audit the Postal Service's routing errors." "The statute requires fiduciary diligence," Rebecca interrupted, turning her head just enough to fix Spencer with a look of absolute, glacial pity, "which your firm traded for an automated batch filing algorithm. Furthermore, Your Honor, if petitioner insists on validating this writ today, we are prepared to petition for a full forensic discovery of Pembroke's proprietary servicing software across all 82 counties in this judicial district. We believe the routing error that defaulted Mrs. Lawson is not an isolated bug, but a hard-coded feature designed to accelerate equity liquidation on reverse mortgage portfolios." Spencer's magnetic stylus slipped from his fingers and clattered against the hardwood floor. He didn't pick it up. The color drained from his ears. A class action discovery order into Pembroke's source code would cost his firm $4 million in billable software audits before a single deposition was even taken. Judge Davis stopped rubbing his temples. He looked over his reading glasses at Spencer. Then he looked at the 2 massive, silent men sitting in the 3rd row in their Sears work shirts. "Mr. Spencer," Davis said softly, Does your client wish to open their server logs to the State Banking Commission to verify HUD compliance? Spencer swallowed. His Adam's apple bobbed like a cork in a drain. Your Honor, petitioner requests a 5-minute recess to consult with corporate counsel. Granted, they didn't need 5 minutes. They needed 90 seconds. When Spencer returned from the hallway phone booth, his shoulders were slumped 3 inches lower than his collar. He didn't return to the podium. He stood beside his briefcase. Petitioner voluntarily moves to dismiss the writ of possession, Spencer mumbled to the floorboards. With prejudice, the escrow adjustment will be recategorized as an internal administrative correction. Judge Davis brought his wooden gavel down. Thud. It wasn't a dramatic, cinematic crack. It was just the sound of dead wood hitting dead wood. Writ vacated, Davis said, already turning a page on his docket. Title restored. Item 15. City of Northport versus Valley Sanitation. In the gallery, Deacon Ross didn't cheer. He slowly put his ball cap back on his bald head, adjusted the curved brim, and stood up. He looked at Rebecca as she packed her 3-ring binder into her leather case. You were bluffing about the source code, Deacon rumbled quietly as they walked out into the marble corridor. Rebecca paused, smoothing the skirt of her navy dress. Of course I was bluffing, Deacon. Software engineers don't leave paper trails like that, but corporate vice presidents are cowards. They'd rather lose a $90,000 bungalow than let a junior associate explain their algorithms to a federal judge. Crisis is loud, recovery is boring. The city never issued a formal apology. Pembroke management never sent a contractor back to retrieve the 3 sheets of exterior plywood or the handful of DeWalt deck screws scattered in the flower beds. The machine simply retracted its mechanical arm, rebalanced its internal ledgers, and went looking for a softer target in another zip code. But the street had changed. The invisible containment field had been breached. On Monday morning, there were no 250 motorcycles blocking the driving lanes. There was only one. It was a battered 20-year-old Sportster parked neatly against the curb, leaking a tiny, glistening drop of primary oil onto the concrete. Sitting on the bottom step of the bungalow was Jessie. Jessie was 19 years old, wore a Prospex denim vest with no patches on the back, and possessed a neck tattoo of a sparrow that looked like it had been drawn with a ballpoint pen during a power outage. He had been assigned the morning shift on the newly established Lawson Porch roster, a mandatory rotation enforced by Deacon Ross with the strict, unyielding discipline of a military guard mount. Jessie wasn't carrying a weapon. He was carrying a plastic bucket filled with hot water and Murphy oil soap, methodically scrubbing the black scuff marks Kevin's work boots had left on the front door frame. Inside the kitchen, Edith was standing at the stove, frying 3 strips of thick-cut bacon in a heavy Griswold cast-iron skillet. "Boy!" she barked through the screen door. Jessie dropped his sponge into the bucket, standing up so fast he nearly hit his head on the porch light. "Yes, ma'am? You come inside here and eat this hog meat before the grease congeals. You look like a greyhound that spent the winter under a porch." Jessie walked into the kitchen, taking off his ball cap and tucking it into his back pocket. He sat at the Formica table, keeping his elbows strictly off the edge. As he reached for the plate, Edith stopped him, catching his wrist with her crooked, blue-veined hand. She wasn't looking at his table manners. She was looking down at his feet. He was wearing a pair of cheap canvas Walmart work boots. The sole of the left boot was pulling away from the upper, held together by 2 wraps of gray electrical tape. "What size foot you got?" Edith asked. 10.5, ma'am. Edith let go of his wrist, shuffled 3.5 paces to the hall closet, opened the door, and reached into the dark bottom corner. She pulled out a pair of dark oil-tanned Red Wing engineer boots. The leather was deeply creased around the ankles, the toes scuffed by decades of hitting motorcycle shift levers. But the Vibram soles were thick and solid, preserved by 20 years of sitting in a dry closet. She set them on the linoleum in front of Jessie. "Howard bought those in '98, she said, turning back to her stove. "He put mink oil on the seams every October. Put 'em on. If you walk around my front walk in taped-up slippers, people are going to think I don't pay my help." Jessie looked at the boots. He reached out and touched the heavy brass roller buckles. His throat made a strange, clicking sound. He didn't say thank you. Men who grow up in the county flats don't know how to receive gifts without feeling like they've signed a debt ledger. He just unlaced his canvas shoes, slid his feet into the thick, dark leather, and stamped his heels once against the floorboards. They fit like they had been cast around his bones. By Thursday, the neighborhood thawing process had reached its secondary, awkward phase. Suburban Americans do not know how to handle collective trauma. They are trained to handle property values. For 5 days, the residents of 4th Avenue had lived behind their drawn blinds, watching an old woman's life defended by men their property managers defined as gang members. Now, the heavy iron column was gone, replaced by a single 19-year-old kid in vintage Red Wings sweeping dandelions off the sidewalk. At 4 p.m., Greg, the remote software engineer from next door, walked across his pristine, chemically treated lawn. He didn't bring a casserole. He brought a white plastic box with 2 external antennas. He stood at the edge of Edith's porch, looking at Jessie, who was sitting on the swing reading a dog-eared Louis L'Amour paperback. "Hey," Greg said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. Jessie didn't put the book down. He looked over the top of the pages. "Hey, I noticed the router signal from my office drops off right around your property line," Greg said, pointing awkwardly toward his siding. "I had this extra mesh repeater in my closet. I set up a guest network. It's unthrottled. If you guys, if you want to stream anything while you're sitting out here." Jessie looked at the white plastic box. Then he looked at Greg's dandelions. "What's the password?" "It's just Dogwood 1961, Greg mumbled, his face turning slightly pink. "No caps." Across the street, June's front door opened. She didn't use her tactical peak aperture. She walked straight down her driveway, crossed the asphalt in her orthopedic walking shoes, and set a warm aluminum foil-wrapped Pyrex dish on Edith's porch railing. "It's peach cobbler," Jean said to Jessie, not looking him in the eye. "Tell Mrs. Lawson I used the fresh nutmeg, not the canned stuff." She walked back across the street before Jessie could answer. It wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation. Nobody threw a block party, nobody gathered around a campfire to sing folk songs, but the contagion model of suburban poverty had been broken. The neighborhood had realized that the real threat to their manicured lawns wasn't the boy with the sparrow tattooed on his neck. It was the silent, automated machinery that could turn any one of their mortgages into a pile of cardboard boxes on a Tuesday morning. Late September arrived, bringing the sharp, crisp bite of early autumn to the city. The leaves on Howard Lawson's dogwood tree turned a deep rusted crimson, dropping one by one onto the dead crabgrass that had finally begun to grow thick green patches of wild clover. It was a Tuesday. It was Edith Lawson's 95th birthday. There was no thunder in the streets this time. At 1 p.m., a single motorcycle pulled into the driveway, Deacon Ross's blacked-out touring frame, its big V-twin engine bubbling with a low-contented idle before he clicked the ignition off. He walked up the concrete path alone. He wore his full colors, the winged death head centered on his back, the president rocker on his left breast, the leather stiff from autumn road wind. In his right hand, he carried a brown paper grocery sack. He didn't knock. He opened the screen door and walked into the kitchen. The geometry was absolute. The small Formica table was wiped clean. The radio on the counter was playing a low, scratchy AM broadcast of the afternoon farm reports. Edith was sitting in her chair wearing a clean yellow cardigan over her house dress. Deacon set the brown sack on the table. He reached inside and pulled out 3 items, setting them down in a precise geometric row. First, a heavy manila envelope bearing the official gold seal of the Pembroke County Treasurer's Office. Stamped across the front in red ink was the phrase, "Tax Lion Satisfied, paid in full through 2028. Edith looked at the red stamp. Her pale eyes narrowed. "Deacon Ross, I told you I don't take club charity. I got $1,200 in the Union Bank." "Club didn't pay it," Deacon rumbled, pulling his chair out and sitting down. "We hosted an open bay mechanical clinic down at the old commercial laundry yards last weekend. Charge $30 a head for local garage kids to learn how to rebuild shovelhead carburetors. 240 kids showed up with cash in their fists to learn internal combustion from guys who don't learn it off YouTube. It's Howard's diagnostic labor, Mrs. Lawson. We just collected the 30-year back interest. Edith stared at the envelope for a long time. Her fingers reached out, tracing the raised gold foil of the county seal. Deacon reached into the sack and set down the second item. It was a small plastic blister pack containing a single high-tension steel replacement spring, manufactured by the General Electric Corporation in 1983. Kemp found it at an estate swap in the valley, Deacon said. Takes 5 minutes to swap out. You won't have to hit the side of the toaster with your knuckles no more. I liked hitting it, Edith said softly, though the corner of her thin mouth twitched upward. Reminded me it was there. Deacon reached into the bag one last time and set down the final item. It was a 16-ounce glass jar of Smucker's strawberry preserves, brand new, the red metal lid intact, perfectly sealed against the autumn air. Edith looked at the red fruit. Then she looked across the table at the 62-year-old man with the gray beard, the double prosthetic knees, and the ringing in his ears. She reached out across the white formica, took his heavy, scarred hand, rough as 60 grit sandpaper, and held it tight against her yellow cardigan. You're tracking maple leaves onto my linoleum, son, she whispered. Yeah, Deacon said, his voice dropping into that deep, quiet place where the iron meets the earth. I know. Outside, sitting on the bottom step of the porch beneath the red-leaf dogwood tree, 19-year-old Jesse unlaced his dark red-wing boots, shook a tiny pebble out of the heel, laced them back up tight, and watched the afternoon shadows stretch across the street. The lock was gone, the wood was solid, the street was dead quiet. We live in an era where algorithms decide who gets shelter and spreadsheets measure human worth. But steel doesn't run on software, and loyalty doesn't depreciate. If Edith's story reminded you that real, grounded human community still exists in the blind spots of this broken system, hit that like button right now. Share this video with someone who needs to remember that standing your ground matters. And subscribe to the channel, because we don't tell fairy tale stories here. We track the truth, 1 mile at a time. Drop a comment below. Where would you draw your line? See you on the next ride.